Morning, YouTube. Before I can finalize the base structure for this workbench, I've got to build the spacer that's going to go between the two maple slabs that make up the top. That spacer is removable, and it is what makes a split top Roubo style bench a split top, because when you take it out, you've got a hole in between your two slabs that you can use to hook bench hooks or to put clamps through there or do any number of other things that are actually a little bit difficult if your bench top is solid. There's a couple other functions that we'll get to along the way. Somewhere way down the list is that it is an opportunity to introduce a decorative element into the bench. And so my split top splitter is going to be made out of walnut. The walnut I've got in front of me is a bit of a hodgepodge. I don't have any real target dimensions for this. The top comes out however wide it comes out. So I just milled these kind of as thick as the wood would allow, and they came out almost a full inch. There's about a 1/16 thin of that inch. And then these pieces, which are going to ultimately make up the dividers, they came out a 1/16 under 3/4. The only other thing I've got to figure out is where I want to put this stuff. Clearly, I need a couple of inch wide spacer at each end of the beam to make it nice and stiff. But the rest of this material I can cut up into some random width and space out somewhere along here, because the gaps that it leaves are going to end up being tool rests for chisels, saws, and whatever else. What I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to decide that my small piece of scrap stock here, which is 8 3/4 inches long, is going to set the dimension of the end pieces. So I will take the next one in length, I will cut it to match 8 3/4. We'll put those at the ends, and we'll see what we have left and divvy up something for the middle.
I'm going to use my favorite clamp as a stop block trick to get these things the same length. You could gang cut them if you want to. One important thing about this process is that you do have to make sure you've got nice square ends before you go button them up against the clamp.
After I got done cutting this end spacer, I was left with this offcut, which I looked at and said, why not? That looks like as good a size for another spacer as any. So I cut one to match. And I have a sort of a symmetrical thing going on here where I've got the 8-inch blocks at the ends. I've got 3-inch blocks that I'm going to space about 10 inches apart from there. And then a piece in the center that's going to give me 2 10-inch tool wells on either side of the center. And then I don't know, not quite 10 and an 1/8 spacer in the center, so that this thing will be good and solid in the center and the ends, blocked in the middles, but I still have 40 inches of tool well space, which has got to be enough. I have all of my spacers glued in place, and at the moment they're just tacked down with some spring clamps. This is not really enough clamping pressure for this thing to dry properly, but I want to let that glue at least tack and get sticky so that all these things don't slide around and move on me when I go to put the other board on top. I'm going to let this sit here for 5 minutes, something like that, and then I'll come back and make the complete sandwich and clamp it up solid. What was that about? You can never have too many clamps? I went ahead and wiped up the glue squeeze out because this whole thing is going to get planed down flush and even, so any smearing will just get shaved right off. Sun's up, means it's time to go to work. I'm going to let this dry until the work day is done. We'll come back this evening and see about fitting it in between the slabs. Once the glue dries, you can shave down these inserts nice and flush with the sides using a block plane, hand plane, or take the whole thing over to the joiner, whatever you have available to you. You can kind of see how this comes out with these 4 slots in it that are going to be nice and roomy for dropping chisels or saws or whatever in the middle of the bench while you're working. Speaking of middle of the bench, that's where I need to put this thing to get it spaced appropriately so that I can get to work on the base. I'm going to have to block my bench top up a little bit to get this whole thing flush on the bottom side. This is currently a 1/2 inch and change thicker than the bench top. And why will become obvious after a fashion. All right, I got my bench top clamped back together so that it sits nice and square, only now the removable tool tray is clamped in the middle there. I folded up a couple of index cards put them on either side of there because I don't want this to be so tight that I can't get it in and out. The index cards are as good a spacer as any. This piece of maple is going to be my stretcher between these two legs that sits flush against the underside of the bench top, and the bolts that hold this top to the leg assembly go clear through here and into the top. The critical dimension on this piece is the length between the legs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut away the top corner of this thing so that I'm going to make a mortise and tenon joint, but the tenon is going to be the full width of this piece and 1/2 the height of this piece.
All else being equal, I like to make critical cuts on the table saw by carefully setting the blade height and then checking to make sure that I have the blade exactly where I need it. I can get this cheek cut to be dead on. I can cut the rest of the tenon with the table saw as well, but not quite all the way. I just made a pencil mark on the fence to let me know where the wood is being cut on the underside, and then I make sure and stop there before I go too far. Cleaning up the rest of the tenon cut with a handsaw is easy because there's enough of the face of the tenon there to guide the edge of the saw.
Cut the tenons down to their final 1.5 inch length on the table saw using the sled, and now I've got my little trusty Starrett square set so that it will exactly center this piece here on the leg. I have another square that I bring down here to the far end and make sure that the leg is square to the edge of the bench. That tells me that this is exactly where my mortise needs to go. As it turns out, I can't reach underneath with a pencil, and a knife line is going to be more accurate anyway. Now, of course, there's not room to get this thing in here with the front leg in place, so now I got to switch legs, do it again.
In some woods, it's easier to deal with a nice square mortise hole than with the mess that a drill press will leave you, but hard maple is not one of them. So I drilled out the corners of my mortises with a small bit and then hogged out the bulk of the material with a 1¼ inch Forstner.
Well, we want these mortises to chop themselves, but they never do. All right, with those mortises cut, let's see if we can't do a little dry fit here and see how this thing's gonna go. So far, so good. Well, that is all right. Well, chopping mortises by hand in hard maple is no fun, but that is a good, strong joint that is going to last the lifetime of this bench. I'm not worried about it at all. That's going to do it for today. Questions or comments, leave them below. Think about hitting that sub button while you're down there. Next time we'll finish the base by putting in the stretchers that go long and short ways, about here or so on the leg. That should be interesting because I still haven't made up my mind what kind of joinery I want to use on that. Guess I better make up my mind by next week. Meantime, you stay safe, YouTube.